Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
At the family reunion, the one my parents insisted was long overdue and finally a chance for everyone to reconnect, my dad stood up after dinner, holding his glass like he was about to make some presidential announcement. And with this overly proud smile that he always seemed to save for my sister, he said he wanted to take a moment to recognize an incredible achievement in the family. He looked directly at Jessica, my younger sister, the so-called golden child who, from the time we were kids, could trip over her own shoelaces and still somehow be called graceful, and he started this whole speech about her latest professional milestone, throwing in phrases like groundbreaking work and making us all proud, as though she had just single-handedly cured cancer. Everyone clapped, of course. My mom beamed like she was watching her daughter win an Olympic medal, and then, in front of the whole table, my dad pulled out an envelope and handed Jessica what he called a little something to support her next steps. She opened it right there, saw the check, and tried to hide her shock, though not well enough, because the corners of her mouth kept curling up. And I sat there, smiling like I was part of the cheering squad, even though I could already feel that familiar tightness in my chest that comes every time they parade her around as the embodiment of success, while I sit there like the understudy in a play I never auditioned for. Then, with the timing of someone who thinks they're the funniest person in the room, my dad turned toward me. He had that look, the one where his eyes narrow just enough to make it seem like he's about to do something clever, but in reality, it's going to land somewhere between patronizing and humiliating. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small box, and handed it to me with a kind of mock seriousness, as though this was some grand moment of its own. "For you," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, but with this tone that suggested there was an inside joke the rest of the table was already in on. I took it, smiling because if I didn't, it would look like I couldn't take a joke, and in this family, if you can't laugh at yourself, it somehow proves you're too sensitive. The box was small enough to fit in my palm, light enough that I could tell whatever was inside wasn't anything of real value, at least not in the monetary sense. And as I sat there, holding it while my dad stared at me with that expectant grin and Jessica pretended to be curious, I could feel the energy shift. Some people leaned in, others just waited quietly, but I knew every single person at that table wanted to see what was inside. So, I opened it. And in that instant, I noticed something strange. The second I lifted the lid, a few faces around the table changed, like they'd just been slapped with a thought they weren't expecting. My dad's smile froze for a split second before he recovered it. My mom shifted in her seat. Jessica's eyebrows twitched up, and then she tried to hide it behind a sip of her wine. I looked down at what was inside, and I swear the first thing I felt wasn't even shock, it was this sudden, sharp clarity, like a puzzle piece sliding into place after years of not quite fitting. In that moment, I understood exactly what he was doing, why he was doing it, and how he thought this little performance would land. But here's the thing, he had absolutely no idea what that tiny box had just set in motion in my head. He thought it was harmless, maybe even playful, one of those family gags that gets retold at every gathering for the next decade. But it wasn't. Not for me. And I should probably tell you that, growing up, there was this unspoken rule in my family. If Jessica did something, it was worth celebrating. If I did something, it was worth noting, but not worth throwing a party over. Jessica gets into a mid-tier college? My parents throw her a dinner and invite the neighbors. I graduate top of my class? A nice job and a card. She starts a business that barely makes it a year? She's an entrepreneur. I buy my first house? Must be nice you found something in your budget. It's been a lifetime of that, and I got used to keeping my head down, staying quiet, and not giving them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. But that night, sitting at that table, holding that box, I realized I wasn't going to swallow it this time. I didn't react right away. I didn't say anything sharp or dramatic. I just closed the lid, set the box down next to my plate, and let my dad think he'd gotten the reaction he wanted, that quiet, awkward pause before someone changes the subject. But while they moved on, my brain didn't. I could feel the slow, simmering calculation starting in the back of my mind, the kind that doesn't stop until it finds an answer. And as I kept my smile and nodded at whatever story my uncle was telling, I knew I wasn't just going to let this slide into family lore as another funny moment at my expense. No, this was going to become something else entirely. Because, and I mean this in the least dramatic way possible, you can only push someone to the sidelines for so long before they figure out a way to flip the entire game. And that little box? That was my starting whistle. What my dad didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that he'd just given me something far more valuable than a check. He'd given me a reason. And before the night was even over, I already knew exactly where I was going to start. When I finally had the privacy to really look inside that box without a dozen pairs of eyes pretending not to watch me, I understood why the reactions at the table had been so mixed, because sitting on a tiny cushion was the old, scratched-up wristwatch I had saved up for when I was 15, the one I gave my dad for his birthday back when I still thought gifts could fix whatever was broken between us, and tucked underneath it was a little folded slip of paper that, when I opened it, said in his unmistakable handwriting, "Maybe this will remind you of the only time you tried." It took me a second to process it, not because I didn't get the meaning, but because I couldn't quite believe he would have the nerve to hand that to me in front of the whole family and act like it was some clever joke. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he'd stored that watch all these years, clearly not because he treasured it, but because he'd been waiting for an opportunity to weaponize it, to turn something I'd once been proud of into a punchline that would land exactly as he wanted it to. I kept my face neutral, which was harder than it sounds, because the easiest thing in the world would have been to toss the box back at him, tell him what I thought in front of everyone, and storm out. But if there's one thing I've learned in this family, it's that when you give them an emotional reaction, they use it as proof you're too sensitive or can't take a joke, and I wasn't going to hand him that satisfaction. So I smiled in that polite, detached way that makes people uncomfortable because they can't quite tell if you're amused or plotting something, closed the box, and slid it into my bag as if it were nothing worth discussing. But the truth was, in that moment, I felt the entire dynamic shift, not for them, but for me. For years I'd been quietly absorbing the digs, the comparisons, the way Jessica's missteps were painted as charming quirks while my accomplishments were treated like basic expectations. I'd learned to swallow my pride because it was easier than inviting another round of subtle jabs. Yet holding that watch, reading that note, I felt something change. It was as though I finally saw the pattern for what it really was, not just favoritism, but a deliberate shaping of a narrative where I was always the one who almost made it, while Jessica was the one who truly succeeded. Dinner moved on without me saying another word about it, and everyone seemed relieved when I didn't make a scene. My dad leaned back in his chair, laughing with one of my uncles like nothing had happened. Jessica was still glowing from her check, and my mom was busy telling someone about the reunion menu. I excused myself early under the pretense of needing to work the next morning, which no one questioned because, in their minds, that's what I do. I work, I go home, I don't cause waves. But as I drove away, my mind was already running through 100 possibilities, and the thing about me that they've never quite understood is that I don't need to win the moment if I can win the war. That night, I did what I always do when I need to untangle a mess. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee, and I started digging. Not into my own life, but into Jessica's latest, incredible achievement, the one my dad had toasted with all the ceremony of a royal coronation. I remembered the vague details she'd shared in her long, self-congratulatory posts on social media about her award-winning project. She'd been annoyingly secretive about specifics, framing it as protecting confidential elements, but I knew enough about her work to follow the trail. It took me less than an hour to find the public description on the award committee's website, and reading it gave me a jolt I hadn't felt in years, because the project sounded almost exactly like something I'd seen before, back when I was consulting for a client in a completely different city. I dug into my old files, pulled up the archived work, and the overlap was undeniable. It wasn't just similar, it was identical in structure, phrasing, and even some of the examples. The more I compared them side by side, the angrier I got, not because Jessica had plagiarized, although that alone was bad enough, But because the entire family had just applauded her for stealing someone else's work while treating me like I was the one who'd never tried hard enough. I sat there staring at my screen, feeling this mix of rage and clarity, knowing that if I dropped this information into the family group chat right now, it would cause chaos, but it would also give Jessica room to spin it, to call it a misunderstanding, to frame me as jealous. No, if I was going to use this, I had to do it in a way that left no wiggle room, no chance for anyone to twist the story. I closed my laptop and leaned back, my mind already moving several steps ahead. This wasn't going to be about proving myself to my parents. I'd given up on that a long time ago. This was about showing Jessica, in a way she couldn't ignore, that I wasn't someone she could keep stepping over while pretending it was accidental. I thought about the box, about that watch, about the years of small humiliations I'd shrugged off, and I realized this was my moment to flip the narrative. But I also knew I had to be patient, to wait for the right setting, the perfect timing, because revenge that's rushed is messy, and I wanted this to be clean, undeniable, and memorable. By the time I went to bed, I had the beginnings of a plan forming, not fully fleshed out, but sharp enough in outline that I could already see the ending. And the best part? I knew they'd never see it coming, because they've spent my entire life underestimating me. That was about to change. When I woke up the next morning, I could still feel that slow burn at the edges of my patience, the kind that usually fades after a night's sleep but refused to go anywhere this time. And instead of pacing around replaying that stupid box moment or the note that should never have been written, I sat down with my coffee and made myself do the one thing that has always worked for me when emotions start trying to steer the ship, which is to separate what I feel from what I can prove, because feelings are easy to dismiss in this family, while proof has a way of ending conversations before they start. I opened the files I had pulled, lined up Jessica's glossy project description against the older material from my consulting archive, and then pulled up the public page of the client I remembered from back then. And seeing those phrases match like puzzle pieces cut by the same machine gave me a calm I hadn't felt the night before, a steadiness that said this was not a grudge or a jealous sister story. This was theft in heels dressed up as talent, and it deserved the kind of response that did not require me to raise my voice or even say her name. I started with something simple and, to me, fair, which was reaching out to the original creator, a woman named Nora who used to run her own small firm before she merged into a bigger agency, and I wrote her a message that was careful and clear, explaining that I had come across a project receiving attention that mirrored her published framework line for line, that I held archived drafts with timestamps because I had been looped in on a pilot years ago, and that I wanted to know if she was aware of this situation or if I was the first to bring it up, and I added that I was not trying to stir drama for personal gain, but I also was not going to pretend I had not seen what I had seen. She replied faster than I expected, her note short and clipped in a way that told me she had no patience for this either, saying she had noticed the language popping up in places she did not license and had let it slide while dealing with a family health issue, but that she had all original drafts server logs, early decks, and email trails, and that if I could provide screen captures and public citations, she would consider her options and decide whether to nudge the award body first or release a simple, factual statement that could not be spun as sour grapes. That was the first time in a long time I felt the ground tilt in my favor, not because I wanted to hurt my sister in some petty way, but because the situation finally lived outside the small room of family dynamics and into the space where actions have real-world consequences, and while that might sound cold, it is also where I am strongest. Because I do not need to win the argument if I can win the audit. We traded files for the next hour, building a neat folder where each claim sat beside a dated proof, and as we built that chain, I kept hearing the echo of my dad's toast, the way he said, making us proud. And I realized he has always confused applause with integrity, as if the number of hands clapping could change the origin of an idea. And I decided right there that I was not going to argue with him later about fairness or parenting or the way he uses jokes like blunt instruments, because the best answer to a performance is to pull the curtain, not to yell from the audience. With the evidence lined up, I took the first small step that, to me, already counted as revenge, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was clean and impossible to dodge. As I created a new email address that did not tie back to me and wrote a measured note to the award committee, attaching two concise documents, one showing the one-to-one overlap between Nora's original framework and Jessica's submission, the other listing public links and earlier publication timestamps, and I signed it as a concerned industry professional who valued ethics and wanted to avoid public embarrassment for all parties if this could be resolved quietly, which is funny when you think about it, because I would have loved for the whole thing to be loud. Yet what I wanted more was certainty that it would stick. Sending that note felt like slipping a stone into a well and waiting for the echo, because you do not see the splash, but you know something heavy has been set in motion. I did not stop there, because one message, no matter how careful, can disappear into a pile or get brushed aside by someone who wants to protect their own reputation for picking winners. So I took a second step that was, in its own way, even more satisfying, which was to plant doubt where it would travel the fastest with the least pushback, meaning I texted my cousin Leah, the one person in the family who actually reads things before forming an opinion. And I told her I had stumbled across a weird coincidence in Jessica's project description that matched a case study I had worked on years ago, and I asked her to take a look at a couple of public links and tell me if I was seeing it wrong. Because I have learned that people resist being told what to think, but will sprint toward a conclusion if they feel they reached it themselves. Leah called me 30 minutes later, half whispering like she already felt guilty for recognizing the obvious, and she said what I needed someone else to say out loud, which was that the match was not a coincidence, and that if she, a non-expert, could see it, people in the industry would rip it apart in minutes if given the chance. I thanked her, told her not to bring it up with anyone yet, and let the silence do the work, because silence in a family that gossips is never empty, it is a fuse. In the afternoon, Nora wrote to say she had decided on a two-step approach, professional and boring on the surface, yet devastating beneath. First, sending a formal inquiry to the award body asking them to review a potential breach of originality with attached exhibits, and second, preparing a short public note that did not accuse anyone by name, but laid out a simple, dated timeline with links, which would go live only if the committee ignored her or tried to deflect, and she asked if I had any preference on timing, which made me laugh in a way that was not funny, because I realized I finally had leverage over a pattern that had never budged, and I told her I did have a preference actually. Since my family would be attending Jessica's next presentation at a local business forum where she was scheduled to walk through this very project, and that if the formal inquiry could land just before the event and the public note could be cued for the moment she took the stage, the impact would be clear without me having to utter a single word in that room. Before we signed off, I took one more personal step that may sound small, but felt like a victory I had owed myself for years, which was to forward my dad a polite thank you for hosting the reunion. Nothing sharp, nothing sarcastic. Just a grown woman acknowledging hospitality, and I attached a single image file without a caption, a side-by-side excerpt from the two documents with dates visible and identical language highlighted, because I wanted him to sit with it privately, to feel that pinch of doubt that maybe his instincts are not as flawless as he wants everyone to believe, and then I put my phone face down and let the quiet hang. The committee's auto-reply hit my new inbox before dinner, the kind of generic acknowledgement that proves nothing and yet told me a clock had started. Leah texted me a vague, "This is going to get messy," that I did not answer. And Nora confirmed that the formal complaint was in the right hands and the public note was drafted and ready, which meant the first moves were done, the board was set, and all that remained was timing. And I cannot explain how peaceful it felt to know that for once I was not going to be dragged into a shouting match or a kitchen lecture about how sisters should support each other, because I had chosen a lane where the truth walks on its own and does not ask for permission. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and counting the tiny wins I had stacked without anyone knowing, my phone lit up with a new calendar invite forwarded from my mother. All caps and exclamation points about Jessica's big forum talk this coming weekend, and how the whole family had front row seats, and I smiled in the dark because sometimes life schedules your finale for you, and all you have to do is show up and let the work speak, which is exactly what I planned to do when The lights went up and everyone turned their phones over and saw the same headline at the same time. The day after I set the pieces where I wanted them, I woke up with a kind of quiet focus that does not come from anger anymore, but from the relief of having a plan that does not need permission. And instead of replaying old arguments in my head or drafting speeches I would never give, I opened my email to a short confirmation from Nora saying the formal inquiry had been received by the award committee's general counsel with an assurance of internal review, which told me they had moved it out of the inbox of social media interns and into the room where people think about liability, and that alone felt like the first, neat click of a lock turning. I spent the morning doing ordinary tasks so that no one could accuse me later of obsessing, and when my phone finally buzzed with a new message from my dad, a simple, "Call me when you get a second," I stared at it a long time before letting it sit unanswered. Because I knew what that call would be, a mixture of fake concern layered over an implied warning about family loyalty, and I did not owe him the chance to steer anything back into the private lane where he always wins by declaring himself the referee. By lunch, a second email arrived, this time from the award body's program manager, as bland as oatmeal and yet delicious to me. Because it said they had temporarily paused promotional assets featuring the highlighted project while they conducted a routine verification of originality sources, and that they appreciated the professionalism of the materials provided. And in that instant, I understood what victory can feel like long before the crowd notices it, because when institutions quietly pull a spotlight, a person who lives on applause is left blinking in an empty room. I took a screenshot, saved it to my evidence folder, and did not forward it to anyone, not even Nora, because the committee had already copied her on their phrasing about verification, and I wanted to save my words for when they would land the hardest. Mid-afternoon, Leah called with that breathless tone that tells you family news is spreading like smoke, and she said Jessica had posted a vague story about haters and petty people who do not build, only tear down, which made me smile despite myself. Since nothing exposes a guilty conscience like preemptive defense, and Leah also mentioned that my mother had started checking in with relatives about attendance for the forum talk, reminding everyone to be early because we had reserved seating, which was hilarious, given that the only thing I needed from them now was exactly that, a front row view. I thanked Leah, told her to stay out of the crossfire, and then I did the one small, exquisitely satisfying thing I had been holding in my pocket since the reunion night, which was to box up the old wristwatch and slip it into a padded envelope with a short handwritten note that said, in the same tone my dad used when he turned family cruelty into comedy, "Returning your prop. I won't be needing it for the rest of the show," and I dropped it at the post office without ceremony, not because I needed him to read it before the forum, but because I wanted the gesture on the record for me, a line drawn in ink that said I do not play that role anymore. With the watch mailed and the committee's pause confirmed, I turned to the event itself, because timing without placement is just luck, and I do not rely on luck when a clean outcome is possible. So I registered on the forum website under my own name and under a second, generic name for the open audience questions they collect in advance. Careful to write one question that sounded technical and neutral while pointing directly at source attribution standards, and another that asked whether the presenter could share raw drafts with metadata for educational purposes, which would force a choice on stage between transparency and evasion. I also sent a short, courteous note to the forum moderator from a professional address, attaching a single-page brief about best practices in citing frameworks during public talks, which I framed as a resource to avoid confusion during Q&A. And I added that I was happy to share links on request, which is the kind of message moderators love because it looks like someone else is doing the homework for them. For good measure, and because every domino falls faster when there is an audience, I forwarded Nora's soon-to-be public timeline to a local business reporter I know from a client project years back, with a quiet heads-up that an award program might have a small integrity issue surfacing during a community forum, making clear that I was not the source to quote and that the primary materials would be public if and when the original author chose to post. And he replied with a curt thank you and a promise to attend, which meant there would be eyes in the room that were not there to clap. None of this felt like scheming to me. It felt like an audit the universe had been postponing and that I had finally scheduled. Right before dinner, my dad tried again, this time with a longer text that started with, "I'm worried about the tone things are taking," and slid into a lecture about family unity and how public embarrassment helps no one. And I stared at that message for a long time because it captured everything I had ever needed to know about his priorities, the way he mistakes silence for peace and image for truth, and I typed one sentence back that I knew would lodge where it needed to. Integrity is not an attack, it is a mirror, and then I turned off my phone and went for a long walk with no music, not to calm down, but to savor the feeling of having decided that my dignity would no longer be the currency with which everyone else purchases a pleasant evening. On the morning of the forum, Nora sent a final confirmation that her public note was queued with timestamps, links, and a concise closing line about standards. Ready to go live the moment Jessica began her talk if the committee had not responded with a formal action, and, because I appreciate symmetry, I set a simple reminder for the start of the session and printed 2 copies of the one-page brief I had sent the moderator, sliding them into my bag next to the now familiar folder of side-by-sides, not because I expected to wave papers around, but because there is a certain steadiness that comes from knowing every claim fits inside one clear page. We arrived as a family in that awkward caravan way where everyone pretends we are here to support the same thing, and I took my seat in the front row like a polite audience member who has no intention of speaking unless invited. While my mother fussed with her program and my dad leaned over to whisper something about letting bygones be bygones, to which I replied with a pleasant nod that did not commit me to anything at all. The room filled, the moderator took the stage with his upbeat patter, and Jessica stood at the side, smiling for the cameras as if the universe had not already moved the ground under her feet, and I felt that calm again, the kind that means the timing is set. The players are in position, and the clock has started. And as the lights shifted and the moderator called her name, my phone vibrated once in my bag with the unmistakable buzz of a scheduled post going live somewhere that mattered, which meant the first public domino had fallen, and all I had to do was sit back, look at the stage, and wait for everyone else to hear the echo I had been listening to for days. When the moderator finished the introduction and Jessica walked out with that careful smile she saves for rooms that already like her, I felt that same stillness I get right before hitting send on an email I know will not need a follow-up. And as she launched into her talk with the familiar cadence she always uses when she is carrying someone else's weight as if it were her own, the first ripple moved through the audience in a way you can only catch if you are watching faces instead of slides. Because phones lit up in synchronized little flashes and thumbs started scrolling in that absent-minded way people do when their brain is trying to decide which thing in front of them deserves priority. And I knew the post had gone live because the reporter 2 rows back sat forward the way a dog does when it hears a car door and recognizes the sound of a familiar arrival. I did not touch my phone because there was no need to, and I did not look at my parents because their reactions belonged to them now, not to me, and I let Jessica keep talking while the room quietly moved away from her in real time without her noticing it yet, which is a particular cruelty, but also a kind of justice when you have built a story on borrowed lumber. About halfway through her deck, the moderator, who had clearly also seen the notification, raised a hand with the kind of polite interruption that is rehearsed as courtesy but functions like a break. And he asked a gentle question about methodology sources and whether there were frameworks she wanted to credit out loud for the benefit of the practitioners in the room, and there was a beat, not long enough for most people to notice, but long enough for me to catch the exact moment she realized something was wrong, because her smile tightened and she reached for a sentence that sounded like transparency while giving nothing away, and she named a couple of authors who were safe to name, but did not touch the one framework that actually shaped her entire case study. The moderator nodded, and because I had seen his face tilt when he read my one-page brief earlier, I knew he was not finished, so he opened the audience submission list and, bless him, called a question that sounded neutral to everyone else, but landed like a subpoena, asking whether raw drafts with metadata could be shared for educational review, and whether the award body's originality verification had involved third-party materials. And the silence that followed was thick enough to count. I raised my hand not like a crusader, not like a sister with a score to settle, but like a person who has read the rules and intends to follow them, and when he called on me I stayed seated and spoke in a tone that would pass any reasonable person test. And I asked if the presenter could walk us through the development history of the framework step by step, and whether she could point to any published lineage prior to her submission, and I added that this would be helpful for younger professionals who are still learning how to distinguish between inspiration and replication. And in that moment the reporter's phone buzzed again, and he took a picture of the stage, which meant the public note had reached the second ring of the pond. Jessica answered with a word salad about collaboration and best practices and the spirit of sharing, and the moderator, now fully aware of the ground shifting, opened his tablet and read, in his careful neutral voice, a brief statement just received from the award program announcing a temporary suspension of promotional activities tied to the project while a standard review of originality was completed. And I watched her face do the math on stage as the applause she had counted on began to feel like a misplaced reflex even to the people doing the clapping. My dad leaned in from my left and said my name under his breath in that tone that means stop this right now, and I did not look at him, because there was nothing to stop, and when the floor opened for live questions, I did not speak again. Since the point was not to perform, the point was to let process stand up on its own legs, and it did, because a woman 3 rows back asked a plain question about attribution, and a man near the aisle asked whether the timeline in the public note matched the dates on the slides, and the moderator, who had started the hour hoping for an easy session, now had a different job, which he did well, by keeping the questions on integrity and not on gossip, and by closing the session with a statement about standards that sounded simple and landed like a verdict. After the talk, the air in the lobby had that tight feeling people get when politeness is losing its grip, and my mother kept her hand on my arm as if proximity could unspool what had already been woven. And Jessica came toward me with a mix of anger and pleading in her eyes that reminded me of childhood, and she said we did not have to do this, and I told her that we did not. That all she had to do at any point in the last few months was write one sentence that said the framework was adapted from a public model with permission, and instead she had tried to build a brand on a borrowed foundation, and that this was not personal until she chose to make the applause louder than the truth. My dad tried to jump in with a vague line about family unity and how outsiders should not decide fate, and I said one thing I had planned to say only if he cornered me, which was that integrity does not care about last names, and that the inbox he was worried about had timestamps older than any toast he could raise in a rented ballroom. There was one last move I had kept for this exact hallway, not because I needed it to win, but because I wanted the end to be clean, and I pulled a small letter from my bag and handed it to Jessica without ceremony, explaining that Nora had decided not to pursue damages if a public apology and full credit were issued within a reasonable window, and that the award body would very likely restore her standing in a different category if she owned the mistake outright. And she stared at the paper, like it was written in a language she had forgotten, and then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, which told me that pride was losing its argument inside her chest. I turned to leave, and my mother asked if I felt good about myself, which is the kind of question people ask when they think justice must always be joyless, and I told her I felt calm, which for me is better than triumph, and that I was heading to meet someone for coffee. That someone was Nora, who had flown in at the last minute because she believed, the way I do, that a clean ending is one you can stand next to in daylight without needing spin. And we sat down and agreed to build a small workshop series together for young professionals on attribution and ethics, not because I needed a trophy, but because I wanted to convert this mess into something that feeds better habits. And as we sketched the outline, I felt a thought I had been circling for days finally land, which was that revenge is sweetest when it does not need to be called revenge anymore, when it looks like accountability and leaves enough space for the other person to repair what can still be repaired without you carrying it for them. Back home, a package was waiting on my porch from my dad, and inside was the watch I had mailed with my note, returned again with nothing added, and I laughed once. Not in meanness, but in recognition that some people cannot read the room even when the room has changed walls, so I placed the watch in a drawer I rarely open and wrote him a simple message that said I would not be attending the post-forum dinner, that I loved my mother, that I wished Jessica would take the offer, and that I was done playing silent so others could stay comfortable, and then I turned off my phone and let the quiet be mine. In the weeks that followed, the award page changed to a small line about reclassification and proper credit. The forum clip of the moderator reading the suspension statement found its way into people's feeds as a training example in how to handle uncomfortable truths in public. And Jessica sent a short message saying she had met with Nora and signed the apology we had discussed, and that she would be taking a break to regroup, and I did not reply because the conversation no longer needed me. Which felt like the best outcome I could have written even if I had tried, and maybe that is the part one hope lands for anyone who has been told their effort does not count, that you do not need to smash the table to turn it. You can tilt it inch by inch until every loose piece slides toward the truth, and when it does, you will not need to explain the ending, because the ending will explain itself.